Get the show on.
All right, we're ready.
Cool. All right, I'll call to order our study session for August 10th. Our first item this evening is the fire season update thus far. And our presenter will be the new fire chief, Nick Brown, who I had the pleasure of having coffee with this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It was definitely a pleasure. I really appreciated your time this morning, and it was awesome to be able to get to meet with you. I appreciate Mr. Mayor, members of the council, for allowing me to come and give you a quick update on the wildfire season. And Ann, thank you so much for helping arrange this and get this coordinated. I want to touch on real quickly July 4th. I just can't thank you enough for the partnership, working side by side with Ann and Chief Strait, and then eventually having you guys help to ban fireworks for the 4th of July. I was genuinely concerned with the conditions that we were having. And what I'll tell you is that Clackamas Fire only responded to one firework related fire on the 4th of July, and it was not in the city of Milwaukee. And normally 4th of July is a very busy time for us. Most of them are bush fires that sometimes unfortunately extend to houses, and we didn't have anything of that nature with this 4th of July. And I genuinely believe that is the focus of the council of the city of Milwaukee and the county and the other cities, putting that focus on community safety and educating our public, and then in your case, banning them in the city limits of Milwaukee. So I just wanted to thank you very much for that partnership, and I just wanted to say thank you. I wanted to dive in briefly into the 2020 season of wildfires, kind of talk about where Clackamas Fire was, where we are now, and then where we're going and the current conditions that we're seeing. To just give you a quick brief recap in 2020, on September 6th, I was 4 days in as the operations chief of Clackamas Fire. And so I had a little bit of trial by fire, literally, in that new position. And in the first 72 hours of that incident, which to be quite honest, I was awake for, I think, 96 hours straight, as was most of my firefighters and command staff. We were running on 72 to 96 hours straight until we got a break from the state. But in the first 72 hours, Clackamas Fire responded to and mitigated 144 working fires. Of those 144 working fires, 22 of them were greater alarm incidents. And a greater alarm incident for us is we have a predetermined set of resources that respond to fires. So if it's a house fire, it's typically 4 fire engines, a ladder truck, a heavy rescue, a medic unit, and an incident commander. And a second alarm would be a greater alarm incident that doubles the amount of resources. And for an organization in the size of Clackamas Fire, we typically go on a third alarm fire once every 3 to 4 years. The mill fire in Oregon City, that was a third alarm fire. And Clackamas Fire handles a third alarm fire with our resources perfectly fine. Anything above that, then we start diving into mutual aid partners, Tualatin Valley, the other organizations within Clackamas Fire. But in the first 72 hours, we had 22 second alarm or greater fires. We responded to a total of 223 incidents because there were some medical calls that happened as well as those fires. We had a total of 1,311 apparatus responses during those 72 hours. What is a little bit crazy here is the first 6 hours of this incident at 6 p.m. We from 6 p.m. until about midnight, we responded to 35 working fires. Of those 35 working fires, we had 11 greater alarm fires, and 6 of those greater alarm fires were 3+ alarms, with 3 of them being 7+ alarms and lasting the duration of the incident. And so we were moving and shaking. And I couldn't have been prouder of the men and women of Clackamas Fire and the standing army of 404 that answered the call and faced what we faced, which was a historic natural disaster. And there was a lot of lessons learned. We did a lot of great things during those fires, but we also had some things that we didn't do so well. And so what we did is we exposed our underbelly, and we went to an outside consultant to do an after action review, which is posted on clackamasfire.com. And out of that, they gave us a lot of things that we did well, and they gave us some things that they thought we could improve on. And so what the focus of Clackamas Fire has been is using those after action review suggestions and really enhancing our wildland preparedness and our preparation for this season. And then also in this plan is it's basically broken into 3 sections. It's kind of like a 1 year, 3 year, 5 year model with a lot of regional suggestions in there. We utilized Cal Fire in California, a retired chief out of there for 45 years on the job, Kim Zagaris. He led the after action review. And so just so much great information, useful information that we've been able to put in play in preparation for this year. 2021 fire season outlook. And this is not going to come to any surprise to anybody. All we have to do is look outside and this is going to make sense. But this is kind of the predictive services that the Forest Service uses, that we use to give us an outlook of what we're facing this year. Northwest Interagency Coordinating Center, which the predictive services, a climate and significant fire potential outlook for August through September 2021. We have obviously warmer and drier than usual weather, and it's expected to predominate over the Pacific Northwest through September. Fire danger will worsen as August progresses and continue through September. We are in July, we were seeing fuel moisture content and conditions, which we don't typically see till end of August, which is a huge concern to me. Our 10,000 hour fuels, our 1,000 hour fuels are at 13%. That's unheard of for this area. You see that a lot in Central Oregon. You see it in Southern Oregon. You see it in California. You never see it on the West side. And that's what our 10,000 hour fuels, and the 10,000 hour fuels are kind of, it would be like Mayor Gamba's screen that shows there with all those trees. Those are what considered 10,000 hour fuels. So it's the big fir trees, things of that nature, our forests. And so why that's concerning is when we have a thunderstorm that comes through like we did last week. That's why we're having so many rapid fires progressing right now in the state, is because lightning strikes and you get automatic takeoff. Whereas in previous years, it might smolder and get resources there in enough time to put it out. Right now, what we're getting is lightning strikes and we're getting rapid growth. Our 100-hour fuels, which is basically like our brush, that's the stuff that we'll see at your waist high brush, those types of things. That's projected to be at 9% throughout the remainder of this week and continue through. It's dry. It's really, really dry out there, and so we're super concerned. Already this year, we've had within Clackamas Fire, we had on April 16th, which in my whole career I've never seen this kind of conditions in April. We had a 40-acre grass fire on Nyber Road. It was the Nyber Road fire, and we had level 3 evacuations that were implemented. We didn't lose any structures. Our firefighters were able to mitigate that fire, but we had a 40-acre fire in April. Then 2 weeks ago in Oregon City, it had been 3 weeks ago, sorry. In Oregon City, we had off the 99 fire off the south end, we had a 10-acre fire that started from the road and ran up the hillside. And we were able to mitigate that. We did have to implement level 3 evacuations for that fire as well. But the thing I was really excited about for that fire in particular is our regional partners in ODF. We were able to call iron, so bulldozers. That's what an iron is, or traco. We were able to call them. They were able to come in and bring in heavy machinery, the bulldozers for us. and they also brought a hand crew through mutual aid. They didn't have any air assets, and so helicopters, and none in the state. And something that we learned from September's fire is Clackamas Fire established its own resource list. And so what we did a lot in the off season was reached out to companies, and this one in particular is Precision Air. I had just talked to the operations chief at 10 a.m. that day and secured him as being on our resource list. And no joke, 6 hours later, I'm calling him on the phone saying, there's no helicopters in the state. Can you fly? And he goes, yep, I'm 15 minutes from the hangar. I'll get in my helicopter. And he was there, and he was dropping buckets of water within 40 minutes of my phone call, which really set us up for success on that fire on 99E. And again, that was lessons learned from last year and the after action review. Because forever we so often depend on a regional partner like ODF to order those types of assets. We went out on our own for that. We have started I'm really proud of this since September. We started a type 2 hand crew within Clackamas Fire. Now, this is the first of its kind in the state of Oregon for a municipal fire department. There's no other municipal fire department in the state that has this. It is a type 2 hand crew. It's a 20-person hand crew. And what they are is they are instead of applying water, they take the fuel away. So they'll dig a hand line to take the fuel away, so that when the fire comes, it stops right at their hand line. They also will do backfiring and things of that nature. And then when they're not on the fire, they're actually a fuel mitigation crew as well. Now, this has been a partnership with Work Source and Clackamas Community College. They're what has helped to start up this program. And they have been working all summer. They were on the Grandview fire. They were on the Bootleg fire. They've been on the Jack fire. They just we're down in Southern Oregon. They've got extended a couple of days, and then they'll be back home. They've been getting utilized throughout the state and mitigating a lot of fires throughout the state and been getting high reviews. I'm super proud of this crew in its infancy and what they are doing and how they are representing Clackamas Fire and the citizens of Clackamas Fire. Expecting a lot of great things out of this program. And we did it as kind of just a beta test to try to see if this thing, if it would work. And it's proving to, excuse my language here, but it's kicking butt. That's the only thing I can say. We purchased an additional Type 3 engine, which is a beefed up brush truck, and that's stationed out of Beaver Creek Station, Station 10. So now we have these Type 3 off-road urban interface brush trucks that are in Beaver Creek, Happy Valley, Boring, and Redland Road. And we've put them at most of our high risk for that wildland urban interface. When I started as a battalion chief, we only had one, and that was in 2017. And since 2017 till now, we have 4. And so we're still projecting to go down that way, but of getting more of those assets. But it's a fiscal impact, and so we're measuring it over time to purchase those. We also added a Type 6 apparatus, which is a typical brush truck. It's a smaller brush truck, good to go off-road, just has smaller amounts of water on it, typically 250 gallons versus 350 to 400 gallons like the Type 3 apparatus does. And we have that. It's kind of our floater brush truck. So we strategically place it. Sometimes it's been in the city of Milwaukee. Sometimes it's at Station 3 in Oak Grove. Sometimes we put it at Station 8 off of Jennifer and 130th, just depending on where we are forecasting and where our other resources are allocated. Again, just to talk on, we established that resource list of local contractors with that heavy machinery and helicopters, and we've been putting it to work. So really excited about that resource list that we've established. We also increased staffing to the Eagle Creek Station 18 area, and that went to 24 hours a day. It was only staffed at 40 hours a week. Now it's staffed 24/7 with 3 firefighters that are paramedic certified in the Eagle Creek community. I wanted to give a small update on how conflagrations come into be. And that is what I've just sent resources down south on, is above Crew 30. The state will initiate a conflagration, or we will initiate a conflagration, and that opens up the door to get state resources. So in the case of September, when we realized that we had utilized all of our mutual aid partners, which you have to do in order to initiate a conflagration from the state, we then call the AOC and contact the Oregon State Fire Marshal's office and let them know that we have a conflagration. They get the governor's signature, and at that point, they then can allocate resources from the state. Typically what happens is they bring in an overhead team of an incident commander and a operations chief, and then they'll bring in resources from east, west, north, and south. And now the beautiful thing about where we live with Milwaukee and Happy Valley and Clackamas Fire is we have the 3 biggest fire departments in the state of Oregon, with Clackamas Fire, Tualatin Valley Fire, and the city of Portland. So Oregon State Fire Marshal's office depends on our 3 agencies quite heavily. And just because we have the resource pool, so we're very resource rich in this area. So for us to declare a conflagration in 2020 was a little bit of a shock, I think, for the state as well as the area, but all 3 departments had fires everywhere. And so I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of a background of what conflagrations were and the process that has to go into that. We've got our Ready, Set, Go program, and we implemented that in May. And that's what we declared as Wildfire Preparedness Month. And our deputy fire marshals have been out educating the public and focused on really educating the public on 3 areas. Number 1 is creating a defensible space for homes and businesses. And then within that, we have a wood chipper grant. And this wood chipper grant is through Clackamas Emergency Services Foundation. We've secured about $50,000 at this point in grants that we've been able to offer to members of the community. And this is to create that defensible space around their homes, especially after the ice storms with all of that, the trees that have fallen and the branches. It's a way for communities and homeowners to get those dense fuels, chip them up, and get them cleaned up and create that defensible space for their homes. And then we've helped them to understand what level 1, level 2, and level 3 evacuations are, the Ready, Set, Go program. So that has been really the focus of Clackamas Fire, is preparing our people, preparing our citizens, and then preparing our firefighters for the season that we're just into the thick of things with. The other piece is that we've also focused up in educating our public on signing up for public alerts, because declaring a level 3 evacuation is no good if the community doesn't know what that means and isn't able to get that information. And CCSO, Milwaukee PD, OCPD, those guys are phenomenal. And how quickly they get into neighborhoods to evacuate neighborhoods, we couldn't do it without them. It's just flat amazing what they can do. But they only have so much personnel. And so having our public sign up for public alerts that get access through the county, that's crucial. And so that's really what we've been focusing on for Clackamas Fire. It is dry out there. We have sent more crews on conflagrations this year to help the state than we ever have since I've been at Clackamas Fire. It's really important that we educate our public. And I just want the city council to know that Clackamas Fire, we're here for you. That's our existence. We have 404 men and women that have sworn an oath to do all they can to protect you and your homes, and we've got you. And so I know there's a lot of fear in the communities, and I just want you to know your firefighters are well trained, they're prepared. We've learned a lot from last year, and every single day we strive for innovative ways to better provide service. And so I just wanted to give you that quick update, and I thank you so much for your time, and I'm willing to answer any questions that you might have.
Anybody? Any questions? All right.
Said
Well,
this earlier, Actually, Mayor, if it's okay, I deeply appreciate the chief's comments about staff during the 4th of July situation. But I also just wanted to call out, it was really wonderful having a partnership with the fire district. They were so responsive. It was quick. It was easy. We were all on the same page and we were all leaning into it together. And it truly felt like a partnership. So I just wanted to also call out that it's always been a great relationship with the fire district, but it was incredibly helpful at a time when we were all a little stressed to have him jump in with both feet with us. So thank you so much, Chief.
Thank you, Ann.
I just wanted to ask the Oregon City fire you were
Yes, ma'am.
describing along 99E, that is the one that was caused by sparks from a train?
Yes. So initial reports where we had a hill fire in downtown Oregon City, which we did. Crews were able to arrive and mitigate the emergency without too much of destruction to any vegetation. There was no structural damage or anything like that. But after investigation, it was 100% determined that sparks from a train got the hillside going and started that fire. Like I described earlier, the 100-hour fuels being at 9%, the 10-hour fuels are even drier. So it is, and that's kind of what started from the train, was those 10-hour fuels, and then went into the 100-hour fuels. So yes, it was 100% caused by sparks from the train.
Thank you.
To just go a little deeper into that, just out of curiosity, typically the railroads do a decent job of keeping their beds pretty clear of vegetation. Were they behind on that, or was this just the sparks reached far enough out that they passed?
Yeah, and typically on that stretch, they do a really, really good job of making sure it's clear. I think it was just one of those situations that the wind was right and the spark was right, and it caught some embers, or caught some fuels on fire, and then it went, just because it's so dry. That right away is 100% the railroad's responsibility, and typically they do a really good job of keeping that pathway clear. But that's not to say, I mean, there's a ton of area that the railroads go into. That's not to say that there aren't areas where they don't do so good. I just don't know exactly where they are. There's so much rail but that is their responsibility to clean that up, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much. I look forward to working with you on
Yes, sir.
a number of items, and to be continued.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you for letting me come on.
All right. Our next item is the emergency declaration ordinance, which will be presented by Brenna Cruz, our events coordinator.
Good evening, Mayor and members of council. So as you previously mentioned, this afternoon, we're going to be discussing the proposed changes to the city's emergency declaration code. The need for revision was identified during our after action sort of analysis and debrief of the initial response to the COVID-19 pandemic, in which staff referred to the emergency declaration code and the city's emergency operations plan to determine the appropriate response for the emergency at hand. As currently written, the code ordinance is vague. It refers back to the emergency operations plan, which provides circular references that define the authority and process to declare and respond to emergencies within the city. The emergency operations plan is also subject to change with each revision, and it is really meant to demonstrate a process and provide clarity for the roles and responsibilities needed to perform emergency response and recovery measures. So staff have prepared a draft ordinance with the changes needed to streamline the emergency declaration process, to prioritize appropriate response measures and mobilize personnel, equipment, and resources. Staff have revised the existing code based on comparison with other municipalities of the same population size and governance structure. The proposed draft code also aligns with the current emergency declaration process demonstrated throughout 2020 and recently with the extreme heat and firework ban of 2021. The proposed changes will define the authority and the succession of authority to declare an emergency, define the types of emergency declarations that can be issued, establish a process and criteria for emergency declaration, and also allow council to ratify a continuation or termination of emergency declaration based on the event needs. And so with that, I will open to council for their feedback, requested changes, etc. And then also allow Anne and or Justin to kind of weigh in if there's something that I cannot address.
Anybody? I do have a question, and unfortunately it's going to be horribly vague. I remember at one point during one of the emergencies, we were considering doing something that a few of the other cities around us were doing, and learned that our code, our emergency code, did not grant us the powers to do that. Is anybody remembering this?
I
Yes.
think you're referring to the Grubhub delivery fee charge. And I would only caution you that I don't think there were a lot of local jurisdictions that were doing that. I think Troutdale and Gresh Portland did it. Troutdale feigned doing it. And I actually think it was kind of reach for Portland and Gresham to enact that. But then again, at the end of the day, the state came in and did it. I think we've got similar language in this code if we were to want to go down that road. I think really in that instance, it's a kind of an inertia builder to get the state or the county to act that has a larger discretion, more tools in their chest. I think the big thing comes down for local jurisdictions is the enforcement mechanism.
Yeah, I was less concerned with the specifics of that moment than the fact that we could declare an emergency, but we're very limited in what we could actually do with said declared emergency because of our lack of having written those power. The only limitation being that we had not written those powers into our own code.
Well, yeah, I mean, I honestly think that the code, the draft code you see before you, or whatever form of code we actually adopt, I think that was actually supposed to be adopted years ago, contemporaneous with the emergency operations plan. I think it was an oversight to not have a code adopted at the same time, because the emergency operations plan is very general. You know, it refers to specific things, like I think you're getting at, Mayor, but it says you need to analyze whether or not you can do it with a question mark at the end, rather than saying, oh yeah, it's in the code, here you go, here's your authority. And so I think in large part, we're correcting an omission that I think occurred 10 years ago, maybe before when the operations plan was first adopted.
Okay, good. Thank you. Anybody else? Any questions, thoughts? Lisa, I think you're muted.
I was just, I didn't get to spend as much time on the language as I would have liked, but I was just trying to understand the difference between disaster and emergency in the definitions, because I mean, everything on through seems to be about emergency, and there's a ton of overlap in those two definitions. So can you just kind of walk through why we need to and what is supposed to be different about disaster?
Sure. So typically disaster is used to identify more of the nature emergency. So if you had like referencing an extreme storm event, what happened in Chico when I was in college, the governor declared a regional disaster for that area. So it's particular to the specific event that happens. And so it's more so just kind of language that our other agencies like FEMA, the county, et cetera, would use to identify the particular incident.
So a disaster is not a man-made occurrence. Not a, well, I guess
It could
that's
be.
loaded when you talk about climate change. So
Yes.
disaster is not a, well, okay, yeah. I mean, I know in like insurance policies and things, they talk about
Acts of
an
God.
act of God, or they talk about a force majeure, something that is, not human created in the old fashioned way of thinking of human created, I guess.
Yes, and I would also venture for another example, an emergency would necessarily maybe trigger a curfew. For say, example with our neighbors in Portland, they declared an emergency and they established a curfew. That's not necessarily a disaster. That's just a recognized incident that they were needing to manage. I hope that provides some more clarity.
That's good. Anybody else?
I might add that there could be some distinctions too about what sort of funding is available. Regional funding and regional partnerships, disaster areas, a declaration of a disaster may trigger certain things that would be available that might not be available in the case of a localized emergency.
But the way it's set up in the definitions, there's sort of two alternative things, although there's a ton of overlap. Is a disaster really a subset of an emergency, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at.
Kelly?
I'm going to try, but Brenna and Justin should correct me. I think an emergency is something that you can respond to with your resources, and a disaster is something that you cannot respond to with your own resources. You have to establish the disaster to bring in outside resources. That's the kind of the distinction I think I know, but is that right, you all?
Not sure. Under COVID, we declared an emergency in order to be able to bring in CARES Act dollars. I don't know. I think it's a great question, Lisa, and this is actually our first discussion of this topic. We can actually go back and look at the definitional difference and see if there's a reason that we need to clarify that one way or the other. So I'd rather just say we'll come back to you. I can tell you how I have read it differently and why it doesn't trigger for me, which is that the disasters happened, an emergency could happen. So I've actually bifurcated them further. Like, I have an immediate thing that's here today. COVID happened to me before I responded to it. But I also declared that we could have a fire, so we were going to ban fireworks. So that's the way I was reading it, but that doesn't mean it's right. So I think that I'd like to just take these definitions back, have a conversation with Brenna, and let her be the uber smart person she is and tell us this is the way that I would recommend you go based on what our federal process and policies are, if that's okay. But I think it's actually a really good catch. It's just not something I think we've thought through entirely. And I'd like to be able to give you a discerning answer.
Great. I mean, I think it's great to have the more clarity about roles and hierarchies and all of those things. So I think it's the right way to go.
I think another distinction as well is that, you got to remember, under our statutory authority, we're declaring a state of emergency. Okay, you're not declaring a disaster that's occurred. You're declaring a state of emergency under our statutory authorities, right? A disaster, I think, implicates, like Kelly was saying, it's something that has happened and that we need further reaction to. And that might go tandem where there's a disaster declaration. And as a result of that disaster, we then declare a state of emergency that frees up various funding mechanisms and our emergency management plan, organization and administration stuff. So, but definitely we can dig into it a little bit more if you'd like.
I mean, I think the disaster on here talks about has caused or be likely to cause. So it's not like it's all in the past necessarily. And then, yeah, I guess it's just, yeah.
It's a great question. We're
And
gonna
we
get you an
asked
answer.
the emergency, I mean, we would also quite often be asking for supplemental resources in an emergency as well as a disaster, right? So,
I will say that for me, this ordinance is sanity. Because we've now been through, I think, 5 of these in a year. And part of why I really appreciate Brenna, I know she's super busy, but I really deeply appreciate her prioritizing this, and Kelly prioritizing this, and Justin prioritizing this, is because we've been duct taping for a while. This gives us a very clear path that makes this faster and easier for us to reach decision. We're getting good at it. It's helpful that we're getting good at it, but I'd rather actually just have a really clear path in the future. So I think that this does that largely. If any of you feel like it doesn't, please let us know. Or if you have any concerns, let us know. But I think that this also is clear about, I have limited power, but I don't have to get the council together immediately. And that was very clear at the beginning of the pandemic, that it was not possible to do it legally. So I really appreciate that this also just gives us cover and gives you all an ability to cut that off if you need to, but also an ability to extend it if you think it's appropriate.
Well done. Thank you for cleaning that up. Good work. And I guess we'll see what if any clarifications come out of the last discussion.
so I will say, I didn't have time to do the reading I would have liked to do, but I found that this long set of minutes very interesting for all the other things that were in it. Yeah.
I did too. It's like, wow, there was a lot of public comment back in the day.
Okay, we will come back to you, I believe in September. Is that right, Brenna? Or are we in October?
I'll have to check with Mr. Stoffer.
Okay, we'll come back to you soon, but this will be a short item on our agenda, and we'll just plan. If something changes for you and you suddenly have a question, please email us, just so that we can come prepared and keep this as a pretty minor update on the council agenda. Thanks, everyone.
Cool, thank you. All right, our next item is a tree code update, and this will be led by Peter Pasquale, our Public Works Director.
Good evening, Mayor Gamba, Council President Heisey, and council members. I'm Peter Pasquale, the Public Works Director. And tonight also joining me is Natalie Rogers, our Climate and Natural Resource Manager, and Todd Prager. Todd is the consultant with Tarragon and Associates, and Todd worked with the CPIC on developing the code, and Todd actually drafted the draft code. So both of them will be here to jump in when needed. But what I wanted to do was talk about our tree code and focus on sort of the concepts of what we've put together in the code, and not necessarily the language, because we recognize there's still some work to do on some of the language to tighten up some things there. And there's still some, I think, some decision points that we need to make as we go through the refinement of the code. So I've got a little presentation that I put together, and let me share that with you. Dan, can you let me share my screen?
Sure thing, Peter. My apologies. I thought that you were already able to. I'm going to go ahead and make you a co-host, which will let you do that.
Thanks.
Yep.
Can everybody see that? Other than restart the program. So perfect. So it's been a journey. on our tree code. So it started before I got here with our city's visioning process that I think was actually getting wrapped up the first month or two that I was here. And then from our visioning process, we moved into our climate action plan, where we identified a goal to increase our canopy from its current 26% to 40%. We established that goal in our climate action plan back in October of 2018. Our urban forest management plan helped us put together the guide to help us achieve that goal and further documented it. And then we also worked on the comprehensive plan development and included language in that process, policies focused on our canopy goals and urban forest goals. An outcome of that, the first outcome of that was last November, where we adopted new public tree code. So since that time, we've been working on our private tree code with the CPIC and the middle housing efforts that we've put together. And like I mentioned, Todd Prager from Tarragon has been working hard to draft that code for us. Some highlights on the code. So what we've done is we've developed some new code in our chapter 1632 for residential development and residential non-development. And, the plan is to improve that alignment with our vision and goals in those climate action plan, urban forest management plan, and our comprehensive plan. It established new standards for residential development that relate to tree preservation, mitigation standards, tree canopy, tree protection during construction, and also as well as soil volumes, making sure that we have adequate soil when we're planting new trees in development. We made some updates to the definitions, and then we've also put together some new permit requirements for residential non-development, and rolled over and updated some of the review criteria and approval standards for those. And those will, that new language also anticipates fees associated with those permit requirements. And then we've also included some language in that update for low-income assistance as well, similar to what we've done on our public tree code. So the tree preservation standards, and Todd, as I'm going through this, if I miss anything that you'd like to highlight, please feel free to jump in. So we developed these tree preservation standards for residential development to protect existing trees on the site. And the way that we've gone about doing that is we are trying to prioritize trees and canopy based on their native and climate adapted status. So we're setting up a prioritization hierarchy for the different types of trees, because sometimes all trees aren't necessarily created equal. And I've got another slide that will sort of demonstrate that and show as an example. But we do have certain trees, because of their adaptability and because they're native, that we do want to try to preserve. And we're trying to put together a mechanism to preserve existing canopy, because those are the trees that provide the largest benefit. It takes time for new trees to grow. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the next best time is today. So, we recognize the importance of our existing canopy, and we want to develop standards related to that. Certainly, if removal is required, our tree code, as it relates to the residential development, establishes a maximum percentage of canopy that can be removed unless some sort of mitigation is performed. And that mitigation can be fees or through some other discretionary alternatives. So I'm going to have Natalie talk a little bit about this slide.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. So this is a slide, actually, these diagrams were developed by our members of our tree board to kind of justify or explain why tree code is actually really a discretionary process that we're trying to make very clear and objective. So if you look on the left side of the screen, there's kind of this large red cluster, and each of these dots represent trees of different sizes based on the size of the dot, so different diameters at breast height. And then each of the dots, red, yellow, and green, represent priority tree species, with green being high value tree species. You can think of that as our Oregon white oak, compared to maybe a red being a Norway maple, or maybe instead you can represent it by health of tree. So there's certain, looking at this slide, if we were trying to think about preserving trees of the greatest size, development would be placed different than if we were looking at preserving trees of the priority species or maybe a health status. So essentially, when we're incorporating different factors, the location of development might not be the same, which is why we have this hierarchy of different trees and conditions that are composing our preservation standards. And that will hopefully adjust development to be best placed in order to maximize both the largest tree preservation, but then also priority tree species, ones that we care about both for native status, climate adapted status, and cultural importance, as well as preserving the healthiest trees. So we don't adjust development in order to save a grove potentially of already unhealthy, diseased, or even potentially invasive tree species, because we're purely looking at diameter. So one factor, that we will need to do is develop these priority tree lists. And that is something that our new urban forester, Courtney Wilson, who is on staff, and she is being thrown deep into this process already. But that is something we will look to her to work with our tree board to develop. And I also think that these will be great resources for folks to build off of for developing a good yard tree list for planting requirements as well. And the nice part too about these tree lists, keeping them out of the code, is that tree lists can always change. And that's what we look to ensure that we have a healthy and diverse canopy, which is resistant to things like widespread disease or pests, which target particular species such as emerald ash borer.
Thanks, Natalie. I wanted to go back to the last slide too, and just sort of talk about the maximum percentage of tree canopy that can be removed. So this preservation standard, Todd, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this is one of these ones that I still think we need to work a little bit on the language there. But right now, the way that we've got the code laid out is the developer on a residential site can remove, the maximum amount of canopy that they can remove is 33% of the existing canopy. So let's say there's 1,000 square feet of canopy on that site. The developer can remove without mitigation or any other requirements, 333 square feet of that canopy.
Yeah, that's right, Peter. And just one thing to emphasize is that's 33% of the priority tree canopy. So that would include the trees that are healthy, climate adapted,
right,
and those types of things, so not the overall canopy on the entire site.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. So there's some complexity. There's certainly some complexity there.
And the tree preservation standard and the tree canopy standard, which I do believe there's another slide on in a few slides, Those work hand in hand to ensure that we're both preserving priority tree species of large and middle sizes, so that way they can actually grow and flourish into the canopy along with planting requirements, but then also that we're aiming for that canopy goal. And so that's kind of where these two things fit hand in hand. So you have your preservation standards, which is looking at the diameter of the trees and the type of tree they are, as well as the canopy standards, which is the overall canopy coverage of the site that helps us reach that 40% goal. So that's kind of why there's both of them.
Mayor,
Yeah, I have a question about sort of timeline, and this may get a little convoluted, but imagine a scenario where a developer is talking to a property owner about potentially developing their piece of property, and they say, we're going to need a lot more cleared space, and we'd only be able to cut 33% of the canopy. Can you apply to cut X amount for reason of solar access or some allowable reason, so that when we get on the property, there's less canopy for that math to work from? Is there anything in here that sort of forestalls that kind of?
Well, I think that's also why we have the non-development permitting system as well. They would have to apply for permits as long as those trees are larger than the threshold written in the code. The solar access code, as I understand it right now, doesn't allow for removal of large trees as long as, because essentially you have to apply for the solar access provision when the tree is young and you already have your panel on your roof, and you're essentially ensuring that as that tree grows, or no tree will be planted in that space to block your access later on. So that one in particular might be a really hard one to actually utilize to remove a large portion of trees. But there's also, luckily, there's going to be the process of the urban forester reviewing those private permits for residential, which is why it's important for us to do the development and non-development at the same time. Because you're right in that, you know, if a developer did approach a private property ahead of time and we didn't have a non-development review, then they could go and remove those trees, which is why it's important to have these both as a package.
Is there any way to put some kind of timeline or look back on a property for that percentage question?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, you know, one thing that we are doing right now in the natural resources team is we are starting to, as it's coming up with permits and other features for trees in the community, starting to add those as assets into our asset management system, trees as an asset. And that way there is a bit of a history on these trees that have had permits or on sites that have had permits for tree removals. And so, you know, that starts to get more complex when you're talking about trees on private property, because it really only enters potentially into the system when a permit is already issued. But, you know, the urban forester could be looking at a site and there is that discretion already for that position to, you know, deny a permit if it's a healthy tree removal. And it's, you know, now looking at 3, 4, 5 trees being removed. So we will have some sense of history just based on those permits for a site. And so that, of course, is information, public information, which could be shared with Planning Commission and other development review stakeholders. But, you know, it's a challenge when, you know, not being able to track stuff necessarily on private property without it already being flagged through the existing permits.
Right.
You know, I was going to add also, I mean, maybe perhaps another tool would be a large tree removal moratorium as we're going through this process. I know other communities have done that in the past. That may be, is that, Mayor, is that what you're sort of getting at?
No, I wasn't, although it's a great idea. And I do agree that that's something we should look at. To addressing a different problem. I was trying to think of what the legitimate reasons that a property holder could have for removal of trees that then subtracted from the canopy that the developer would be dealing with before he sold the property, and just trying to forestall that kind of behavior.
Yeah. The only, I mean, if in the which we'll bring up later in the slideshow, but in the non-development residential code, there is a list of approval standards, and those are the ones that we have to look to for approval of removal of a healthy tree. So unless it's meeting one of those approval standards, you know, the urban forester is going to be fairly critical when looking at this permit application for why this tree is to be removed. And I would imagine as it's starting to be, you know, widespread across the site of tree removal, that's going to, you know, raise some eyebrows on why, and maybe a further discussion is going to be had with the homeowner. But yeah, there's those approval standards, which essentially restricts the removal of a healthy tree for a limited, like essentially justified reasons.
Right. I mean, the one thing, you know, that we did not add language in the code that limits the number of trees that can be removed, permitted for removal on residential non-development property. But there's a strict sort of approval criteria and standards to go through, that review criteria and approval standards to go through.
Mm-hmm.
We did discuss that. But I think we ended up not going in that direction with the code.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So Natalie talked a little bit already about the canopy standard. So we have this tree preservation standard, and then that's protecting the existing canopy. And then we also have, for residential development, a canopy standard, where the goal is to develop canopy so at maturity that those properties have 40%. So at some point in time, development properties will grow to where there's 40%. So, you know, we're doing that to intentionally preserve and plant on those sites to achieve our canopy goals. And that can be done, that 40% canopy coverage standard can be done by preserving your existing canopy or by new plantings that are going to achieve that canopy goal. And then, of course, we do have some mitigation standards if it's unable to meet those canopy standards. If there's some reason that it can't meet it, then there's fees or a discretionary alternative path that can be followed, that's outlined as well. And, you know, of course, the 40% canopy cover, you know, we identified that in our climate action plan, our urban forest plan. That 40% number, as a reminder, comes from the American Forest Organization. And for a long time, that was sort of the overall standard that they set out for all communities. They've since made some adjustments based on the region that you're in. So, you know, someplace like Tucson or Phoenix, of course, it would be nearly impossible for them to get a 40% canopy coverage in their communities. But places in the Pacific Northwest and other places in the country, out in the Northeast, the 40% canopy coverage is doable. And in some cases, you can achieve more than that. So, you know, there's the benefits of that canopy is, you know, the shading, urban heat island effect. You know, right now we're in a heat emergency. The governor declared a heat emergency this afternoon for the next 3 days. You know, at the end of June, we had 116 degrees temperature. In the shade, it was significantly cooler, but it was still pretty warm. So the shading, the other co-benefits that canopy provides the community is enormous. And then, you know, we've adopted it in our CAP and comprehensive plan as well.
I want to encourage, there's a great article that was in the Willamette Week called "This is the Hottest Place in Portland." And Dr. Shondas from Portland State University, who also developed our Canopy Analytics tool, was interviewed regarding the hottest place in Portland on the 116-degree day, and noted that it's primarily due to lack of canopy and vegetation. And it's also in the communities with the higher percentages of BIPOC community members. So I think it's really important for us to focus on canopy preservation across the city, particularly in these marginalized communities.
And the July National Geographic cover article was on urban heat islands and tree canopies. And it was a great article. I don't know if anybody's had a chance to take a look at it, but it was a fantastic article. So besides those preservation and canopy standards, in those cases where those standards cannot be met, there's mitigation standards that have been developed. So there's fees associated with the diameter of trees removed and the canopy percentage needed to meet the 40% standard that could be paid. But then there's also a discretionary alternative in lieu of those fees that allows an applicant some other mechanisms. So, that includes design techniques and to meet sustainable benefits on the site, reducing stormwater impacts, fossil fuel and energy efficiency design techniques that go beyond our current regulatory requirements, wildlife enhancements, and sustainable agriculture. So those are some things working with planning that probably still need some further refinement as well. But those are some of the suggested examples for that discretionary alternative. Todd, do you have anything you'd want to add on those?
I guess the main thing would be on the mitigation fees. Those would not be included in the code, so that there'd be flexibility to adjust those and kind of as inflation occurs. It's best not to include the specific fees in the code. And the fees, when you look at other communities, mitigation fees can range pretty significantly. So in some communities, such as the city of Portland, the fees, in my experience, are a real deterrent to removing trees wherever possible. So I think the idea was, and what we heard from the tree board, was not to make it easy for applicants to be able to basically buy their way out of preserving trees or planting trees, but having this be kind of a last ditch option to paying the fees rather than preserving trees or planting trees. In some cases, there may be really extenuating circumstances where the trees can't be preserved for whatever reasons. And that's where the discretionary review would come in to maybe describe, hey, we're trying to do a sustainable agricultural development and it's not compatible with trees in this circumstance. So to be able to describe those types of circumstances and have a review that considers some of those outside the box type of developments that we may not be considering, that may be not compatible with trees.
Councilor Beatty?
Yeah, in addition to there's preserving trees in the immediate term and there's preserving trees in the longer term. And I guess I heard some concerns from a neighbor in Ardenwald about a development there where some trees in the right of way were preserved, but because of the way they took their access to the property between the trees or right over the roots of the trees, that those trees are not going to be with us in 10 years. And in that case, there had been an opportunity that, I guess it was a corner lot or something, and there had been an opportunity to take access another way. So are we looking at all of those kind of factors too?
That's actually sort of our next slide, the tree protection standards
Okay.
that we set up as it relates to construction during development. So
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, before you jump to that, I did want to ask, so these discretionary alternatives in lieu of a fee, this is just in the development scenario, not in the non-development scenario.
It's just in the development scenario.
Okay.
Yep, absolutely. And the fees that Todd was talking about, it would be similar to our public tree code where we made updates to our master fee schedule. So tree protection standards during construction. I mean, I think this leads up to what Councilor Beatty was talking about, making sure that our during development that the developer is providing sufficient protection to the trees on the site and also on the right of way that they may be using for access to prevent that damage to the root zone, that soil compaction that occurs, and any of those other unintended impacts that happen during construction. The pictures that I show there are from the new Waverly development that's going on, and I think Todd's been actually working on this as the arborist for that developer. So you can see the big, Todd, I think that's an oak tree, right? That we've put the hard metal fencing around. That's sort of above and beyond what we've done in the past with that sort of snow fencing that's been used, the orange snow fencing. So, the tree protection standards are providing a more robust mechanism to protect the trees that we're trying to, that the intent is to preserve on the site from damage during that construction. So to do that, there's a process to do that. So, the developer working with an arborist is going to have to go through a process and put together a tree protection plan. They're going to have to, once that plan's reviewed by our team, they'll establish those, the root protection zones, and, it'll be on the developer with an audit from our staff going out there and checking on things to make sure that, the things are set up according to plan, similar to what we do on our erosion control, and making sure that trees are being properly protected during construction. So it certainly identifies protection fencing requirements of the code. And it also provides some different prescriptive paths if things are not practicable. That's a word that we don't like to use all the time, practicable, but it does provide some other mechanisms that the development arborist and our urban forester will look at to make sure that we're following the best practices to make sure trees aren't being damaged.
Councilor Beatty, I thought maybe your question, and Peter, maybe you've got a slide where you'll jump into this a little bit more, but I understood your question to be sort of about the placement of the driveway.
Well, in that scenario, it was the placement of the driveway.
So I guess I would have a question sort of piggybacking on what Lisa was talking about, which is, I see there's a little bit of, there's a little bit in the code about setbacks and heights, standards could be adjusted in order to meet, the preservation the preservation goals. I guess I'm also curious about whether we're thinking about other types of standards like driveway placement, or, how, that's, because I'm really interested in that. I mean, I think we're going to have, potentially a lot of conflicts with with a large tree that, needs to be protected and should be, but because of, driveway standards and setbacks and heights and these other things that really, I think if the community, I would certainly prefer, a development happen, the tree gets saved, but, I mean, if it's a fee versus maybe a few feet closer to the fence line, or a change in the way a driveway gets constructed, I mean, I think we all kind of agree about what the best outcome there would be. And so, in addition to setbacks and heights, I'd certainly hope that we're looking at other standards that would be problematic for development of much needed housing.
So Todd, jump in anytime, but I think, that's where we're looking at that tree preservation standard, making sure that, the developer is citing his development appropriately to protect the trees that they want to protect. And I think the picture on the bottom right of the screen shows an example of how the developer there, by making some adjustments to their building footprint or parking footprint, were able to save some additional trees. Is that correct, Todd?
Yeah, that's right. And that's under the existing code where those adjustments were made, because the owner or the applicant was really interested in preserving the maximum amount of trees in this case. To be honest, not all applicants or developers are really as interested in tree preservation. And I think that's where having appropriate deterrents such as mitigation fees, in my experience, causes applicants to be very creative in finding whatever means possible to preserve trees, because they want to avoid fees where as much as possible, especially when they're significant. If the fees aren't significant or the mitigation is not significant, then it becomes much easier to not get creative about where things like driveways are going and just take the tree out and pay the fee. So I think that's where that's going to be important in that situation. On driveways specifically, one problem that I've run into on many projects is there are driveway standards, and I'm sure Peter knows this better than I do, as far as how close or far a driveway needs to be from an intersection and a tree might be there. And I don't know how, I know that's a safety issue with traffic, and if that's an option to be more flexible and exactly where a driveway can be placed, whether it's on a busier street. I know sometimes they don't want the driveway coming out in those areas, but that might be one option. If a tree is potentially could be preserved by placing a driveway in a non-standard location, then that type of flexibility could be written in, but that kind of goes beyond my area of expertise as far as traffic safety, how flexible you want to be.
I think you are reading my mind, because, we have run into that with that standard for other developments, and I don't, and so I am thinking about in what are all of the areas of our code where we might need to place, additional language about tree preservation, as a way, where there might be some more flexibility in order to preserve trees and also, build the housing. To me, this, this is about tree preservation, not tree preservation to stop development. It's, and I think combined, we've got some places where all of those things combined, if there's no flexibility, if we're not sort of applying this lens to all of the places, we potentially have some places that simply won't be able to meet any of it. And, even if the fee is high enough, we'll end up just losing the trees because, everything combined has made it impossible to develop without taking the trees. And I don't think we want that either.
And isn't there a way to, I might be confusing the two different sections of the code, but don't we have a type 3 review process in place for if in the proposed code that would address some of that? Like if you've just got an untenable situation?
Yeah, and I think that yes, sure. My concern though is that that also is a very expensive process for people to go through, and we should just have more flexibility built into the code so that we have, we can avoid, someone who may or may not be a very wealthy developer spending tens of thousands of dollars on lawyer fees to get through something that's actually a pretty risky process, because you can spend all that money and then it's discretionary. So
I'd also like to add, and this is why we're doing tree code along with the rest of the comprehensive plan for parking and housing. Because this is the same kind of challenging questions that we pose to our CPIC, our Comprehensive Plan Implementation Committee, which is how do you balance housing with trees and parking? And I think the intent of our planning team is to build in flexibility so that way we can balance all of these goals. And that's both with setbacks and height standards. So I would encourage when the code comes to council for your review, I would encourage you to bring this up in terms of ensuring that the driveway flexibility is in there to really also balance out trees and housing and parking. And I believe this is a part of it already, but I could be wrong.
And I'll chat with Steve about that flexibility on driveway placement and see if there's something we can take a look at there. But
yeah, there's another thing that we've experienced in the past is minimum lot sizes. And I don't know if our new zoning won't even have minimum lot sizes anymore, but I remember on King Road, that caused us to lose several trees. And the developer theoretically was willing to have some smaller lots to avoid some trees, but we had minimum lot sizes. So that if minimum lot sizes are still a thing in the new zoning, that would also be another piece that I think we should be flexible on.
okay.
Another aspect I just wanted to add on for flexibility that I've seen with other codes is looking at public improvement standards as far as how flexible you can be with sidewalk placement and whether things like curb bump outs can happen where you have maybe a street, you lose some parking on the side of the street, parallel parking to bump out and preserve a tree. Things like that could also be looked at in addition to the items you've talked about.
Yeah, and in past discussions with Steve, our city engineer, Steve, he buys into that thought, or that philosophy of looking at ways when we can use those techniques to save trees. So,
but Peter, imagine a future scenario where we don't have a city engineer that is as passionate about preserving trees. Is there anything about this code, and because I was kind of looking at it, that forces the math on preserving a tree, even if it's going to cost a little bit in some right-of-way acquisition or some other expenditure on a project like that? Is there anything in this code that will cause that to be math that a pure engineer looking at pure dollars and cents projects is going to say, okay, well, I need to not spend this much money because I cut down these trees, so it's cheaper for me to buy 10 feet of right of way or something?
well, the code that we've put together relates to development. So in my mind, these are costs that are the developer is picking up. It's not infrastructure that the city is doing. So, if we're going to look at our city sidewalk standards, the place that we would look at would be making those adjustments in our public works standards to provide some additional flexibility there for sidewalks and driveway approaches and widths of streets and those bump outs and things like that. So, but the developer's still paying to do the work. It's not at a cost to the city, but we're providing the developer some additional flexibility there.
Right, but we are doing, $52 million worth of infrastructure on streets over the next 9 years.
Well, and that would apply to our public tree code. So, and I think when we look at the public side of our tree code, it would relate back to our public works standards as well. So this is what we construct, and this is what we expect developers to construct before they turn it over to the city for future maintenance and operations. So, I mean, that is one of the things that Todd recognized, and Todd, jump in at any time, that there's certainly adjustments that we need to make to our public works standards.
Yeah, that's right. I think there could be probably some more specificity in some of those other standards that are outside of the code, the development code. And because certainly street standards are a major, have a major influence on tree canopy, because street trees, both existing and future street tree canopy has a huge impact and value to any city, including Milwaukee, especially since there's so many cases of unimproved right-of-way within the city where there's many mature trees, and having flexibility to navigate around those scenarios is really important. I know in Lake Oswego, there's great flexibility on altering public works standards to preserve trees, for example. Other places like the city of Portland, it's very difficult. Even when there's really nice trees in the right of way, it's very difficult to adjust public works standards to preserve trees because there's really not that flexibility available. So I think it's a good idea to look at those, which are your public works standards, and make sure that those are accommodating trees.
Anything else on that?
This is a bit of an aside, Peter, but I'm just curious, and I think the answer is in the tree mapping. If you are, oftentimes trees do not obey property boundaries, I've noticed. Mm-hmm. So if you've got someone who's developing a parcel and there's trees, large trees on adjacent properties that have the root zone coming in, encroaching into the development area, I assume those will be captured in the mapping, and then mitigation and preservation efforts will be deployed for those, even though they're not on the property proper.
Absolutely. That is a discussion that we had. So, yeah. If somebody has a big oak tree or redwood that's, right next to the new development, we want to make sure that the developer is cognizant of that root zone and is protecting that root zone as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And then one of the other standards that we've developed in the code is a requirement for ensuring that trees have the appropriate amount of soil for new trees that are going to be planted to make sure that tree is going to be there for the long term. I've got the picture there that you see is an example from like Washington, D.C. So you can see these are apparently trees that were planted at the same time, and you can see the trees that are in the little on the sidewalk with a small area to grow in versus the trees that have the wider area, and you can see which ones are thriving. So, the goal is to make sure that, when trees are planted to meet the canopy requirements, that there's sufficient soil for that mature development of the tree. And the 1,000 cubic feet is sufficient for a large mature tree. So this was also one of the standards that the tree board felt was really sort of important to include. Okay. So we talked about the development standards. So the next piece that we've included is the non-development residential standards, and as it relates to tree removals. So currently, the way that the draft is written is that we are going to require a permit if the tree is at least 6 inches in diameter at breast height. If the tree is 6 inches in diameter at breast height and it's a rare or threatened tree list, or if that tree was specifically planted to meet any of the requirements related to development. And then, of course, if there is a removal, there's also a requirement for replanting. We do make some exceptions for agricultural trees. For example, we don't want to need to permit orchards or Christmas tree farms or any things like that that may be going on. So what we've done is we've developed a permit requirement for removal of trees on residential property. It has to meet a similar approval standard that we've set up in our public tree code. And then there's a fee associated with that as well. So I think we've had a lot of discussion about the diameter size. So, the tree board has been pretty adamant about the 6-inch diameter. But I will share that 6-inch diameter is a pretty big burden for staff. I mean, there's a lot of 6-inch trees and larger in the city on private property. 80% of our urban forest is on private property. That does include commercial and industrial, but so a very large portion of our urban forest is on residential property. So the burden of managing that permit process for every 6-inch tree and higher on residential property it's a big burden. So it's a discussion that we've had with tree board, the CPIC, and I wanted to put it out there because it is it's a heavy burden.
I mean, I remember in terms of CPIC, I mean, I don't remember that we substantively discussed it. I remember that you presented it as sort of what the proposals are or whatever, or that Todd presented it. But, CPIC really, there was only one CPIC meeting where we did tree code in any detail. But we got a letter from a resident who says Portland, we shouldn't use 6 inches, we should use 12 because that's what Portland uses. And I just was curious, do we have a comparison of other cities and which ones are at 6 and which ones are at 12, or what other measures they might be using?
Todd, I mean, I think you have a pretty good sense of where we are, where that 6 inches relates to other communities.
Yes, there are we didn't make a list of the sizes for different communities, but generally it ranges from 6 to 12 as the minimum size for regulated trees. Some go to 8 or 10, and some offer, actually many offer a minimum number of trees per year. So you get to remove, let's say 4 trees per year, up to 20 inches in diameter. That would be Portland, if I'm remembering correctly. That gets back to the mayor's comment about looking back before development, because those loopholes will be used if the code regulates trees of a certain size to remove the maximum number in a non-development scenario to avoid some of the development regulations. So that's something to keep in mind about the permitting a certain number of trees, or if, for example, the development code regulates trees at 6 inches and says priority trees are regulated at 6 inches, but non-development, you're allowed to remove trees over 12, then probably many 6-inch trees will get removed. So it's probably a good idea to have both of those diameters consistent between the two, so there's not incentive to remove trees ahead of development.
Mhm.
I guess also, I mean, to take Peter's point about, the potential burdensomeness for staff. It also seems to me, I mean, I'm no expert on tree sizes, but I'm guessing that 6-inch diameter trees are generally not as tall as 12-inch diameter trees. And so they are, it becomes policing people's backyards, right? I mean, it's like somebody cuts something and the neighbor says, that was over 6 inches, and they call it in or whatever. I can see it's going to be yeah. Although that's going to be an issue, whatever size we choose.
I think so.
Yeah.
Do we have any idea in that 80%, does LiDAR have enough capacity to show us what percentage of that 80% that's on private property of our existing tree canopy is, trees that are above 12 inches, trees that are above 6 inches, anything like that?
Based on my experiences working with even landscape data that I got from Metro, that's old. I mean, trees from 6 feet to 20 feet can appear very similar on LiDAR.
Okay.
It's really ground truthing in inventories, which will help us get that better sense of what's in the community. And correct me if I'm wrong, Todd, that's just what I remember from doing work with GIS and natural landscape layers. So it's pretty hard to do it remotely without having boots on the ground.
Yeah, because I was just trying to get a feel for what effect the different diameter numbers really have on our efforts to preserve the tree canopy.
And what I could recommend is, there are, if we did create a list of high priority tree species, such as like Oregon white oak, particular species of high value could have different diameters of breast height. And I've seen that before in other communities.
I mean, we may be able to use our pilot tree inventory that we're doing with Treecology to use perhaps as an
estimator.
Yeah. Although, trees on the right of way may have different characteristics, they might not have that soil volume that trees on private property have.
Right.
So I don't know. Todd, do you think trees on right of way are going to be smaller in general to trees on private property?
I think that's really hard to say.
Yeah.
Maybe not in Milwaukee because there's so much unimproved right of way that there's plenty of soil in both areas. Place like Portland, probably, I would estimate that there is smaller right of way trees in general because there's a lot more pavement there. I also wanted to mention, Peter, we had talked at one point about looking, maybe discussing with the city of Lake Oswego, since they permit 6-inch trees, and I think they keep pretty detailed records of how many trees they permit annually in different size ranges, and they have much more tree canopy, than Milwaukee, but you might get an estimate there, just how many of these permits they're processing.
Yeah.
If you had a chance to look into that, or
I have not, but you did mention that. Thanks for reminding me about that. Yep.
Yeah, I would be curious to hear more about the experience cities that are doing 6-inch diameter, what experience they're having with the permitting process. I mean, my dad grew up in a tree farm, so I look at a 6-inch diameter and think, well, heck, I'd probably just call him, and not knowing any better, have him cut a tree down for me that was this small in diameter, So there's some practical part of me that's going, are we creating a real monster here? As much as I want to do as much as we can to protect the canopy, I guess I want to have a better understanding of if someone's already doing this, what it is really looking like on the ground for permitting and staff workload and number of times that people have oopsied and not known and done it themselves. Just general experience would be really nice to know.
Council President, this is Ann Ober, same manager, just because we can't see each other on the chart. I think one of the things I just want to call out is the impact on code enforcement that we've already seen just with our right-of-way tree code. And the number, not many, but there are several cases that he's worked on over the last few months. So part of when we talk about staffing, the concerns that we've talked about is how much code enforcement time do we also need in order to go out and do enforcement when something shows up on the side of the road after the fact. So I just wanted to put that on everybody's plate as it's not just the point of the permit, it's the after effects of what happens when it goes wrong. Thanks.
I think it would be helpful along the same lines. I mean, it seems like there's maybe some knowledge or general sense about what the different standards are for different cities. I think it would be helpful to see a comparison.
Okay.
I mean, I've heard 2 now, that Lake Oswego is 6 and Portland's 12. I think that it would be helpful, at least in my mind, to have that list.
We can get that. We'll put something together for that. Any other comments or questions on this?
I wanted to make one more comment about the purpose of regulating trees at a smaller size. And that's because these younger, smaller trees are typically more resilient to development impacts, and they also have smaller root zones. So they're easier to preserve in development, especially as you're looking at increasing density. So in many cases, it could be really challenging to preserve, let's say, a huge 48-inch diameter Douglas fir tree on a lot that's, having a cottage cluster developed in it, versus, a smaller tree is going to be a lot easier to preserve because it needs less space to be protected from development. So that's why cities look at preserving smaller trees, even though they don't have that kind of immediate impact as the larger trees.
Thanks, Todd. Okay. So similar to what we did on our public tree code, we've put together some language to provide low income assistance if necessary and if funds are available. So it would be similar to what we have outlined in our public tree code.
Have we used funds in our public tree code yet?
No, we haven't had any
Application.
any applications for that. And then, one of the other things we're working on, and Natalie, if you want to touch on this one a little bit.
Yeah, so we're completing a contract soon with them, Enviro Issues, and they should be a familiar name for all the work that they've done for the city so far, to help us on some materials creation, kind of an informational branding and informational campaign for our urban forest program, timed to kind of bring out the message of tree code. So a big point of this is working on our urban forest program branding to make a recognizable brand for the city. So that way, when folks are seeing signs or seeing messages from the city, they know that it's coming from our urban forest program. We're also working on information materials for distribution. So this is, think about things like handouts, brochures, and other kind of helpful guides for homeowners and property owners and renters around trees in Milwaukee. And this will kind of aid with the tree code process once we even have code, or even we can, use the example of our public tree code for folks to understand our public tree code. What is a street tree? And then what is a homeowner's requirement or property owner's requirement to care for those street trees? Another thing that they're going to be helping us with is a website refresh, and we're hoping to have this completed in alignment at fall 2021, towards the end of fall. Essentially, we want it to be completed before we would have an adoptable code, and so that way we time it well for community members who have questions about it. And outreach is really a key to our continued program success. A lot of our questions and from the community can be solved by a well-designed informational material. And so hopefully, information to the community about proper pruning techniques, proper management, how to care for your trees, that really reduces the amount of unhealthy trees that we see, and then potentially any conflicts that we see with homeowners and trees on their property. And then also, a goal for our entire urban forest program is to really foster community stewardship of trees. And that really both aligns with concerns around our own natural resource crew having to go out and manage trees, because we should be having communities there to care and love for the trees around them. But it also helps us understand, helps the community understand kind of why it's important that we're caring for these trees, for both their success as well as the community benefits that trees provide. And then, a big part and a big barrier to managing for trees is just, knowing the right management steps. And not everyone wants to do the Googling for it or go to the library to check out a book on proper pruning technique, or, what is a root protection zone, or what should you or should you not do for planting trees in the right place. So I think that a lot of this outreach will kind of help us down the line, but then also just give a little bit of power back to folks who have trees in their property, and knowing how to care for them. And so I added on the side here, here's a few kind of icons from a few different communities. The top one's actually from City of Portland that Enviro Issues worked on. And this is a call before you cut campaign that they did, and essentially to increase awareness of their tree code. And then also, if community members have questions, to call before you cut to avoid some of the penalties that can happen from not following their tree code. And then also, I really love the bottom one for the Let's Plant Albuquerque, just because it really kind of has a united message. And that's kind of part of this outreach campaign as well, as to create kind of a message and a vision for the urban forest program in the future.
I love that one too. Let's make those.
I know Peter and I were joking, like, can we just slap Milwaukee right under it?
Exactly.
Any questions on so far. So I think where we are, so in 2 weeks, I have a meeting with our planning commission. We're gonna talk to them and sort of provide them the same presentation that we provided you tonight. And then I am anticipating that we're going to be talking about tree code again, and I think it's October with the council. And then I think a follow-up meeting perhaps in November, along with Vera and middle housing discussion. And then ideally in December, January, we're going to have code back to council ready for adoption. So with that in mind, are there any questions? Doesn't look like any questions, so.
I really appreciate, Peter, how hard you and Natalie have worked on this for the last many months. This has been an incredible lift. And I really appreciate the forward thinking that you're putting into the rollout of this moving into the coming 6 months. So thank you, exceptional presentation. And I really appreciate the research and time and effort. Same to you, Todd. I know that I didn't name you, but we could not have done this without you. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
As always, thank you for this wonderful closing slide. It's so helpful for community members to know exactly where to go for questions and comments about, you know, when we have a presentation like this. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Great presentation, great work.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank the tree board for us as well, please.
We'll do that.
Well, I do believe that it's the last thing we have on our agenda, and apparently not.
It is the last thing on the agenda. I just have a topic that I wanted to talk about. So after our last meeting, we discussed COVID and we discussed having people in rooms together and trying to figure out what we were going to do with meetings. This meeting was already scheduled to be online, which was very helpful, and it gave us some time. I really appreciate talking to Councillor Faulkner and Councillor Nicodemus about kind of what they're looking at as their families. And as I mentioned to them after the meeting, I spoke with some staff who also have kids and were equally concerned. So if it's okay with council, my recommendation is that for the next couple of months, we actually move to an online venue for council meetings. We'll know more with where things are with kids getting vaccinated here, hopefully in the next few weeks. But if that's not the case, I just don't want to set anybody's expectations that we can do it faster. So I'd like to, if you're okay with it, push this out until probably at least December, the first meeting in December. And we can talk about it as we learn more. Is that okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Makes sense.
Thank you. I really appreciated the conversations. And just so people know, the city of Milwaukee is still providing services at our counters. There were a couple of concerns. One is that masks are now mandated inside buildings. It's really hard for all of us to hear one another when we're masked and on air. So it's not working super great. The second piece is we're not checking vaccination cards. And so we just don't know who's in the room or not in the room. And so that was adding to some of the fears. So I really appreciate that you all are being so flexible with us. And I think it's a great move. So thank you very much.
Good decision. All right. Is there anything else? Seeing nothing, we are adjourned. Thank you all.
No.
Good night.